right, welcome to On the Edge. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Connecticut and talk with money manager, author, radio host, Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff, welcome to On the Edge.
Thanks for having me on the Edge.
All right, Peter Schiff, I've got my copy of Crash Proof, my personal copy of Crash Proof, your book, the seminal book that I believe could be one of the 5 or 10 best books ever written about markets, finance, and Wall Street. I'm going to go to page 94. You write, slower growth will not contain inflation. You go on to say that as the dollar loses value relative to other currencies, foreigners will be able to outbid Americans for scarce consumer goods. As a result, fewer products will be imported into the United States and more of America's domestic production will be exported. Therefore, despite the fact that financially strapped Americans will be consuming much less, they will be paying much higher prices for the privilege of doing so. This goes against most people's understanding of how the economy works. Elaborate on this, please.
Well, you've got this Keynesian or neo-Keynesian idea that inflation and economic growth or unemployment, high unemployment, are somehow mutually exclusive, that as long as you have slack in the economy and idle resources and unemployed workers, that you can't have inflation. I mean, no matter how much money the government prints, that prices are not going to rise. And that's nonsense. In fact, reality is just the opposite. People who are employed in making things keep prices down. In fact, prices will fall if you have a lot of people making things because the supply of things goes up. And so the price of those things can go down. When people aren't working and aren't being productive, you have a scarcity in production. And that makes prices go up. And when you throw cheap money on top of it, when you have inflation being created by the central banks and you have more and more money chasing a diminished quantity of stuff, prices could rise much faster in a weak economy than they would in a strong economy.
All right, let's keep on this theme a little bit here. The dollar is weak, and U.S. companies in March sold the most goods and services overseas in nearly 2 decades on this weak dollar. However, the trade deficit has widened as the price of oil has gone up. So there's some interplay between the policies that we're seeing coming out of the Fed, et cetera. But to stay on this theme of the global economy and markets and inflation, can you talk on this point a little bit?
Yeah, the problem with selling more stuff at lower prices is that it's now more expensive to import. And your trade deficit can go up even as you export more because you're earning fewer euros or fewer Swiss francs or Australian dollars for your exports. And now it's more expensive to import. And you end up with a rising trade deficit despite the fact that a weaker currency is allowing you to export more stuff. It's like if you're a store owner, it's very easy for a merchant to increase his sales. All he has to do is cut his prices. If you have a sale, you'll sell more stuff. But that doesn't mean you make more money. If you lower your prices, you don't have the same margins. The idea is to sell and get full price, not have deep markdowns. But that's what the U.S. is doing. We're marking down our merchandise and putting it on sale, and then we have to pay full price for everything we want to import.
Okay, the U.S. economy is deep in debt. That is clear, and the debt problem is getting worse. Now, I was listening to an interview with Jim Rickards over the past couple of days, and he was talking about the fact that, well, to get out of the debt, you've got 3 choices. You can create growth, GDP growth, to grow your way out of the debt. 2, you can increase taxes. 3, you can inflate your way out of the debt. He's saying that the most natural path will be for the government to try to inflate their way out of the debt. And using a term now that's gaining a lot of currency, financial oppression, which ties into QE3, or the end of QE2 and the possibility of a QE3, where the government is keeping interest rates capped at these very, very low levels to basically continue to attack the dollar, and that the government's plan is really to keep attacking the dollar. So is that a fair statement? Is the government's plan to keep attacking the dollar? Continue. Go ahead.
I don't know if that's their plan, but that's certainly the consequence of their actions. I mean, the reason that they want to keep interest rates really low is so the government can service the national debt. If rates were to go up, we'd have to default. So the way to avoid an official default is to create inflation, keep rates down. But if the government could do all that and the dollar would be strong, they would obviously just assume that happened. It's just like, the analogy I've used is if a student, decides to cut class and, not do his homework, he's probably going to get an F. Now, he just assumed get an A. If he can get an A and still do all that, yeah, he'd take the A. But, he's not going to get it based on his conduct. So we're not going to get a strong currency based on all the things that we're doing to undermine it. But we certainly would prefer, getting a strong currency, because a weak currency is going to be very problematic for the U.S. economy, for Americans. And the greater problem is, as the Fed is keeping interest rates at zero so that the government can service its debt, so that home buyers can continue to have lower payments on their adjustable rate mortgages and all that, we're destroying our savings. We're undermining the incentives to accumulate additional savings. And that's just what the economy needs. We need more savings to be more productive so we can make more investments, so that we can grow the economy, so that we can hire people, so that we can produce things. We are destroying those incentives, and our economy is going to implode.
Okay, I want to stay on this for a second, because what you're saying is, sure, it would behoove the government, actually, in the United States to see a higher dollar. And certainly in countries around the world, as you've pointed out, the higher level of their currencies has not impeded growth. In fact, it's fostered growth. And the example you give recently would be Switzerland. The Swiss franc is on a tear, and yet the economy is growing, and you can see this in other countries around the world. However, the U.S., with this debt burden, and even though they state publicly they have a quote-unquote strong dollar policy, the very mechanism of QE, quantitative easing itself, is a completely artificial canard. It's a construct for the Fed and the government and the Treasury cooperating to buy these longer end bonds, basically, the 10-year bond effectively, to keep rates down. So can't we say, we understand that the government, what they say coming out of their mouth, but their actions seem to indicate that they are engaged in what's being called financial oppression with these QE programs.
Well, QE3 or QE2, I guess we're on 2 right now. QE2 is the very definition of a weak dollar policy. That's what QE is all about. It's about creating new dollars out of thin air. That can't possibly make them stronger. It can only make the dollar weaker. But when you're out to destroy your currency, you can't acknowledge that. You can't admit it, or the whole thing will implode. The Fed wants to sell dollars, so they need buyers. So the government needs to pretend that it's in favor of a strong dollar, so the world is not bracing itself or prepared for the weak dollar. It's like if you want to, pump and dump a stock, you want to talk about how great the stock is, how much it's going to go up, so that you can unload it. You need buyers. You can't trash the stock that you're trying to sell. Who's going to buy it?
Okay, so what we've established here is the government is lying. They say that they're pursuing a strong dollar policy, but quantitative easing, by definition, is a weak dollar policy.
I don't think that should be any kind of big revelation that politicians are lying. After all, that's how they get into office. They're professional liars.
No, understood. So now going forward, the idea of a weak dollar policy, which is what we're saying has been institutionalized at the federal government level and the Fed level, the risk, of course, is that they over-egg the pudding, to use a British term, and they absolutely obliterate the dollar in the short term, i.e. hyperinflation. Is this in the cards? Do you see this happening?
Yeah, they're not going to just create a little bit of inflation, enough that it's going to be like Goldilocks. They're going to create just enough inflation to inflate away a significant portion of their debt and to revive the housing market, but not too much inflation to destroy the dollar and undermine the economy. And that's not going to work. They're not going to be able to finesse that. You can't let the inflation genie out of the bottle and then have the genie do exactly what you want and then stick it right back in the bottle.
Now, I want to ask you kind of change gears here for a second. Peter Schiff, you wake up in the morning, you're going to work, you're sitting down at your desk. What are the first 3 websites you visit?
Oh, what do I look at? I generally look at Bloomberg to see what news stories came out overnight. What else do I look at? I go to Google and I check out, if there's any articles that have quoted me or anybody that's referenced me.
Okay, so you Google yourself.
Yeah, I got to keep tabs on what's being written about me, or I talk to a lot of reporters, so I want to know if any of them actually quote me. And what else? I look at the markets. So the first thing I probably look at is my quotes. So I look at the currencies, I look at the bond market, I look at precious metals, I look at the S&P. I kind of look at what's going on in the markets to see if there's anything big that happened while I was asleep.
All right, so you're not surfing a lot of these content sites. There are a lot of internet sites that have popped up in the last few years that are business in nature, and they're kind of off the mainstream. They're certainly not a Bloomberg type of sites. And for example, I'm thinking, I always go to zerohedge.com. I don't know why I said .com twice.
I go to Zero Hedge. Usually if there's an article that takes me directly to it, I generally search. Sometimes I'll search articles. And I look at my own website at Europac.net because I used to put up all of the articles myself, and I gave that job to somebody else. And so we get a lot of good articles on the Europac site. So I go up there and I read those because they're usually pretty good.
All right, I want to change gears again now. I want to get more into some philosophy here. Peter Schiff, what is libertarianism?
Well, libertarianism is a political philosophy that pretty much is what the founding fathers, how they would have described themselves when they established this republic. It's basically a government which leaves the people alone. It's there to protect individual rights from those that would, oppress you or violate those rights. It's not about redistribution of wealth. It's about respecting private property and the rule of law and the freedoms that we all hold dear. It was the philosophy that was dominating the thinking when the country was created, and it's a philosophy that we've very much strayed from over time. And there is a real resurgence going on. There is a Libertarian Party in the United States that hasn't made much headway as far as national office. They have elected quite a few local libertarian candidates, but there is a libertarian wing within the Republican Party, which is how I described myself when I ran for the U.S. Senate as a libertarian Republican. And I think that the libertarian Republican, how that might be different from the neoconservative Republican, is that the libertarian Republicans and the conservative Republicans both want small government, at least in theory, when it comes to the economy. They want the government to stay out of the economy and allow the market to function, but the conservative Republicans tend to want the government to have a more active role in our social lives, whereas the libertarians are more consistent in their approach. They want the government to stay out of everything. They want them to stay out of the economy and stay out of your bedroom or your house and not try to dictate how you should live your life. As long as you're not hurting other people, the libertarians think that you should be able to do what you want with your own body.
Okay, so I get the idea in the libertarian philosophy of a decentralized form of economy and government. There's a meritocracy at play. This is the 180-degree opposite of a centralized government that is into a price-fixing government that's not a free market capitalist government. Now, are there any aspects of the economy of the economy where libertarianism should give way to government management?
You never want government management, but libertarians are not anarchists. I mean, anarchists want no government. Libertarians want minimal government. Libertarians recognize that government does serve a useful and necessary purpose in a free economy. The problem is often government gets too big and it becomes destructive of those ends. And that's how the founding fathers described it. They described government as a necessary evil. They believed it was necessary, but inherently it is a force to do evil. And if left out of control, government will grow to the point where it's no longer serving the national interest, but undermining it. And we reached that point a long time ago in the United States. And, we need to do something to turn the tide before the economy completely implodes.
Okay, the reason I'm asking, and kind of the setup here, is I'm looking at the situation over in Japan with TEPCO. the Tokyo Electric Power Company. This was a large energy utility that's privatized. It's run by private business, essentially. There was an enormous catastrophe at the plant. And what I'm observing here are the libertarians, well, maybe that's unfair to call them libertarians, but the private market interests that were operating this establishment have effectively abandoned ship. And they've run away, and they're seeking help now from their government and governments all over the world. So my question is, where, in the case of a TEPCO, for example, where the idea is that you have the minimum possible government and that the big boys of capitalism should run such things as nuclear plants, it seems to fail. Now, where am I getting this wrong, or what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't know all the details surrounding the failure, but certainly if the private parties that were operating the plant have exhausted all their resources and are bankrupt and do not have the resources to contain the damage, obviously, from a public health perspective, this would be something that government could do. It's almost like an invasion. It's almost like, if foreign power invades you, you have a national defense to protect the entire country. So this is a national emergency. There is a threat to the overall population, and that is a role where government can respond to try to contain any kind of damage to protect the overall population. I mean, I don't see any inconsistency there.
Okay, so my point, I think, is that governments could perhaps be a little bit more proactive by not really allowing these interests to manage these operations to begin with. But let me just continue down this path a little bit and talk about, let's say, Milton Friedman, who is a hero of the libertarian folks. And in discussing such things as social responsible investing, SRI, when asked to Milton Friedman, is there any role for socially responsible investing? He said, no, the role of the corporation is to make money, to make profits, and it should not take on any social responsibility whatsoever. And so I see an intersection here between that thinking, the catastrophe at TEPCO, and what I would characterize as the shortcomings of libertarianism. What are your thoughts on Milton Friedman's statement, and how would you respond?
I don't think so, because in pursuit of private profit, the idea is to keep those profits and not have to relinquish them in lawsuits for damages. So, you can't just be negligent. You can't do something that is going to endanger people who could litigate. And so I think that in pursuit of private profit is going to entail making sure that you're not exposing yourself or shareholders, if it's a public corporation, to costly litigation or damages, punitive or otherwise, that might undermine those profits. But you don't want corporations just engaging in, just charity. Let the individual shareholders be charitable with their dividends.
Just one, final follow-up on this idea. We're talking about nuclear energy and the energy industry as a whole and social responsible investing. Let's take a look at the oil industry, the extractive industry. Oil industry, typically, first of all, they're getting huge tax subsidies for their exploration. It was just revealed or talked about again recently that ExxonMobil's tax rate is almost zero.
Well, I don't think
let me finish. And then the cost, okay, I agree that it's all about cost. We're on the same page there. The cost of the detritus, the waste, the carbon emissions that a company like Exxon puts into the global ecology, which is part and parcel of the global economy, they're not bearing those costs. So isn't there a role potentially for government to establish what those costs are and then to make sure that a company like an Exxon or any of these energy companies actually pay the true cost of their enterprise?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that they're getting a subsidy. The government is not giving the oil companies any money at all. All the government is doing is allowing oil companies to deduct or depreciate the costs associated with their exploration activities. They're not getting a subsidy. And anything that we do to increase the cost of oil exploration is just going to increase the price of oil. If you actually look at the amount of money that the oil companies are making per gallon of gasoline sold in this country, it's pennies.
Okay, Peter, I understand all that, but you're talking about. Let me throw some economics at you here. The $1 in savings that is passed on to the consumer thanks to the tax subsidies that are provided by the government, if they result in $5 or $6 or $10 worth of environmental cost, then net, and we're talking about a company that's creating a huge economic and ecological drag. How is that a benefit to anybody except the few people who run the colossus that is this energy company, ExxonMobil?
Well, again, I don't think it's a subsidy to let them keep their money. But what is the environmental damage that you're talking about? I mean, how do you know that there's $5 of environmental economic damage being done? And then how do you know what the environmental or economic damage might be done, if we were looking for some alternative to the oil and gas?
Right. I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think it's a question that the federal government should be more forthcoming with the statistics on this. We know, for example, that the insurance industry has told us that due to the extractive industries and the carbon emissions, that they have put in something on the order of just under $1 trillion worth of cost last year. The Pentagon, of course, is warning against this. The insurance industry itself is saying we're at risk of going bankrupt because we can't handle the risks on the environmental side. And, of course, if you eliminate the insurance industry, you eliminate private property and you eliminate capitalism as we know it today. So there's a real cost here. I'd like to see somebody really pick up on it and give some accurate numbers to the public so they can make informed decisions. But anyway, that's all the time for. We have this edition of On the Edge with Peter Schiff. Thanks so much for being on the show. The book is crash proof. It's the magnum opus of Peter Schiff. I think it's his best book.
You got 2.0 there, or the original?
It's the original with my own notes in the margins.
Because 2.0 has the entire original, but it has all the added material. So
there you go. So look for that wherever you buy your books. But thanks, Peter, so much for being on the Edge.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge with me, Max Keiser. I want to thank my guest, Peter Schiff. If you want to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.